The idea that you can't buy a house in America for under $100,000 anymore isn't just wrong, it's geographically selective. And that distinction matters right now more than most people realize, because the national median home price sits near $390,000, while entire cities operate at a fraction of that without collapsing into ghost towns. And the disconnect between those two realities is reshaping how wealth, mobility, and opportunity distribute across the country, whether anyone is paying attention or not. Which brings us to number 8 on this countdown, Gadsden, Alabama, a city of roughly 33,000 residents as of the 2020 census, where the median home value has hovered around $90,000 in recent market data, meaning ownership here costs less than a down payment in many metro areas. And before you dismiss that as a statistical fluke, understand that this price point has structural roots rather than temporary panic, because Gadsden's population has gradually declined from its mid-23th century industrial peak, a pattern mirrored across much of the manufacturing belt. And when population shrinks faster than housing stock, prices reset to local income realities rather than national narratives, which in Gadsden means a median household income significantly below the national average and a housing market that reflects that compression honestly rather than aspirationally. Driving through Gadsden feels like stepping into a place that was built for more people than currently live there. Wide streets, mid-century homes with front porches that once assumed multi-generational occupancy, and commercial corridors that show their age without pretending otherwise. And this is where the under minus $100K price tag begins to make practical sense rather than emotional shock, because the homes are not imaginary, they are real, solid structures built in eras when labor was local and materials were durable, but they sit in a labor market that no longer commands coastal wages, and that mismatch anchors valuations, not because the houses are worthless, but because the buying power inside the city remains tethered to regional economic output rather than speculative investment inflows. There are consequences to this kind of pricing stability, and they are neither romantic nor catastrophic. They are pragmatic, because when your home costs $90,000 instead of $390,000, your mortgage payment might fall below what many Americans pay in rent, your property tax bill reflects the lower assessed value, and your risk exposure to interest rate swings shrinks accordingly. But the flip side is equally tangible. Appreciation potential is slower, resale liquidity is thinner, and economic expansion depends on incremental job growth rather than venture capital hype, which means residents experience a different kind of housing cycle, one that feels more like slow weather than sudden storm. And here's the systemic layer most people overlook. When capital concentrates in already expensive metros, smaller industrial cities like Gadsden don't necessarily collapse, they decouple, operating in parallel economic realities where affordability persists not because of subsidy, but because demand never overheats. And that creates a strange irony where the same forces driving housing crises elsewhere indirectly preserve access here, albeit at the cost of slower wage growth and reduced upward mobility for some residents, which is not a moral failure but an economic trade-off embedded in regional development patterns across decades. Living in Gadsden, from all available demographic and housing data, means navigating a city that feels stable rather than booming, where neighborhoods consist primarily of owner-occupied single-family homes, where commercial revitalization happens slowly if at all, and where conversations about rising prices revolve around modest increases rather than bidding wars. And there is a kind of dark humor in that, because while buyers in major metros compete with 20 offers above asking, Gadsden buyers often negotiate calmly over inspection details and closing timelines, as if the national housing panic were happening on another planet. None of this means Gadsden is frictionless, because affordability tied to population decline also implies limited job diversity, fewer corporate relocations, and economic vulnerability to regional shifts, and those constraints shape everyday life, influencing school funding levels, retail expansion, and infrastructure upgrades. But it also means that for buyers prioritizing ownership over velocity, the entry barrier remains tangible rather than theoretical. And in an era when housing access increasingly defines generational stability, that fact alone carries weight. What makes Gadsden particularly relevant right now is timing, because after the 2022 2022 housing surge pushed prices upward even in traditionally affordable markets, many assumed sub-minus $100K cities had vanished entirely. Yet Gadsden remains under that threshold in median terms, proving that affordability in America has not disappeared, it has concentrated geographically. And that concentration is reshaping who can buy, where they can buy, and what trade-offs they must accept to do so. If the national story tells you ownership is unattainable, Gadsden quietly contradicts it. But the contradiction comes with context, slower growth, fewer external investors, and an economy that values durability over acceleration. And that's the tension we'll keep escalating as we move up this list, because the next town doesn't just sit under $100K, it tests whether affordability survives in places with even deeper industrial histories and sharper demographic shifts, and that's where this conversation gets more uncomfortable. If Gadsden feels like a slow recalibration, Anniston feels like a reminder that industrial gravity lingers long after factories fade, and that gravity shows up most clearly in the housing numbers. Because in Anniston, Alabama, a city of roughly 22,000 residents, according to the 2020 census, median home values have hovered around $85,000 in recent market data, firmly under the six-figure threshold that many Americans now consider extinct, and that number alone forces a confrontation with the narrative that entry-level ownership is gone nationwide, because here it persists not through gimmicks, not through temporary foreclosures, but through structural economic compression that has quietly kept valuations grounded for decades. Anniston's population trajectory explains much of this stability, as the city peaked in the mid-20th century when military and manufacturing activity fueled growth, then gradually declined as those sectors restructured and employment bases shifted, leaving behind a housing stock built for a larger community than currently exists. And when supply exceeds demand for long enough, pricing reflects that imbalance persistently rather than cyclically, which is why median values in Anniston have remained under $100,000 even after the national housing surge between 2020 and 2022 pushed many secondary markets upward. Driving through Anniston, the physical landscape reinforces the data. Modest single-family homes with traditional Southern architecture, tree-lined streets that suggest former density, and commercial corridors that function but do not expand aggressively. And this is where affordability becomes less abstract and more tactile, because you are not buying a theoretical asset here. You are buying a real structure, often built decades ago with materials that predate modern cost-cutting and priced according to local earning power rather than speculative demand from out-of-state investors with remote salaries. But affordability at this level carries layered consequences, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest, because median household income in Anniston trails national averages, and wage growth has not mirrored the housing acceleration seen in larger metros, which means while buyers may enter the market at a lower price point, they do so within an economic environment that grows incrementally rather than explosively. And that slower economic pace shapes everything from retail diversity to healthcare expansion to infrastructure investment cycles. There is also a subtle psychological impact to living in a place where your home costs $85,000 while headlines scream about $500,000. Starter homes elsewhere, because it reframes what expensive means entirely. And residents here often experience housing as shelter first and investment second, which is almost radical in a culture that increasingly treats property as leverage before it treats it as living space. And the dark humor writes itself when you realize that in Anniston, you can pay off a mortgage in the time it takes some metro residents to negotiate rent renewals. Yet systemic critique matters here, because the same structural forces that suppress prices also suppress upward mobility in certain sectors. And when population declines persist across decades, municipal budgets tighten, public services must stretch, and economic revitalization becomes a slow, negotiated process rather than a market-driven surge. And this is where affordability becomes a double-edged statistic, providing access to ownership while also reflecting the absence of high-income inflows that might otherwise diversify the local economy. Aniston's under minus $100K housing market is not accidental. It is the product of long-term industrial transition, demographic contraction, and limited speculative intrusion, and that stability insulates it from the volatility seen in fast growth regions. But it also means appreciation tends to be gradual, not exponential, and resale depends more on local demand than national trends, which makes this kind of market appealing to buyers seeking cost control rather than rapid equity growth. In practical terms, owning a home in Aniston may mean lower monthly payments, reduced exposure to interest rate spikes, and property taxes proportionate to assessed value rather than inflated comps, but it also means accepting that economic dynamism will likely unfold at a different tempo, shaped by regional employment patterns rather than venture capital cycles. And that tempo influences lived experience in ways spreadsheets cannot fully capture, from quieter streets to slower retail turnover, to a community that measures change in years rather than quarters. The broader implication is uncomfortable but important. Sub-minus $100K housing markets still exist not because they are undiscovered gold mines, but because economic growth in America is unevenly distributed. And towns like Aniston reveal that unevenness clearly, offering access to ownership at the cost of participating in slower capital expansion. And as we move further up this list, that trade-off sharpens because the next city under $100,000 carries a deeper industrial legacy and a more dramatic population shift. And with it, an even clearer illustration of what affordability really signals in modern America. By the time you reach Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the illusion that sub-$100,000 housing is a temporary anomaly starts to collapse entirely, because this is not a micro town hidden in the woods. This is a city of roughly 41,000 residents, according to the 2020 census, large enough to support hospitals, schools, and regional commerce. Yet with median home values hovering around $80,000 in recent market data, and that combination forces a more uncomfortable question than the previous towns did, because when a city of this scale maintains prices that low, it is no longer a curiosity. It is a structural outcome. Pine Bluff's population trajectory explains much of that structure, as the city has steadily declined from a mid-20th century peak that exceeded 50,000 residents, reflecting the broader story of Southern industrial restructuring and agricultural mechanization. And when job bases contract or diversify more slowly than national averages, housing demand adjusts accordingly, not in dramatic crashes, but in long-term recalibration. And that recalibration leaves behind homes built in stronger economic decades, now priced according to present-day earning power rather than historic ambition. Walking through Pine Bluff feels like encountering scale without acceleration. Residential streets that stretch comfortably, mid-century ranch homes, older brick properties with generous lot sizes, and a commercial district that functions but does not aggressively expand. And in this environment, the under minus $100K price tag becomes less shocking and more analytical because it reflects the intersection of population contraction, median household incomes below national averages, and limited speculative investor pressure compared to faster growing metros. But what makes Pine Bluff particularly revealing is how affordability intersects with lived reality. Because when median home values sit near $80,000, monthly mortgage payments often fall below typical national rent averages, creating a pathway to ownership that remains financially accessible even as national headlines declare the opposite. Yet the same economic conditions that enable those prices also mean job growth is moderate, retail diversification is gradual, and infrastructure investment unfolds within constrained municipal budgets. There is a kind of dark arithmetic embedded in Pine Bluff's housing market, because while buyers in high-cost regions compete aggressively and absorb debt burdens stretching 30 years, residents here often negotiate calmly over homes that cost less than many urban parking spaces. And that disparity feels almost surreal when viewed side by side. But it is not accidental. It is the product of decades of regional economic divergence that concentrated capital in certain corridors while leaving others to stabilize around local productivity rather than national speculation. The systemic critique is unavoidable because affordability in Pine Bluff signals both opportunity and imbalance. Opportunity in the sense that ownership remains achievable without extraordinary leverage. Imbalance in the sense that wage growth and population retention have not mirrored coastal or Sunbelt booms. And that dynamic shapes everyday experience, influencing everything from school enrollment numbers to small business survival rates to the pace at which neighborhoods rehabilitate aging properties. Residents here often navigate a paradox. Low housing costs reduce financial pressure, but slower economic velocity can limit upward mobility within certain sectors, creating a housing market that feels stable but not explosive. And that stability insulates Pine Bluff from the volatility that rocked higher growth markets during interest rate spikes. Yet it also means appreciation tends to be incremental rather than transformative, which for some buyers is a feature rather than a flaw. Importantly, Pine Bluff did not escape the 2022 housing surge entirely. Prices did rise modestly during that period, but they remained anchored under $100,000 in median terms, demonstrating how deep structural factors override short-term national trends when local demand remains proportionate to income levels. And this is where the narrative of scarcity becomes selective, because scarcity exists intensely in some metros while excess housing stock persists elsewhere, and Pine Bluff embodies that divergence clearly. Living here often means larger lots, quieter streets, and ownership without catastrophic debt ratios, but it also means engaging with an economy that evolves gradually rather than exponentially, and that slower cadence shapes emotional experience as much as financial spreadsheets do, creating a rhythm of life that contrasts sharply with overheated markets without necessarily replicating their upward wage trajectories. If Aniston illustrated industrial contraction and Gadsden showed measured recalibration, Pine Bluff underscores scale without surge, proving that cities of meaningful size can still operate under $100K medians without implosion, and that realization destabilizes the assumption that affordability has vanished entirely, because it hasn't. It has redistributed according to capital flows and demographic shifts. And as we climb further up this list, the next city will intensify that redistribution story even more dramatically, with deeper population loss and sharper housing compression. And that's where the stakes begin to escalate. If Pine Bluff represents scale without acceleration, Saginaw, Michigan represents compression after contraction. And that distinction matters because Saginaw is not a small southern city adjusting gradually. It is a Midwestern industrial hub that once carried far greater economic weight and now operates within a dramatically smaller demographic footprint. And that contraction shows up with startling clarity in the housing data, because in a city of roughly 44,000 residents as recorded in the 2020 census, median home values have hovered near $60,000 in recent market estimates, a figure so far below the national median of roughly $390,000 that it feels like a decimal error until you understand the structural forces underneath it. Saginaw's population peaked in the 1960s at well over 90,000 residents, before steadily declining across subsequent decades as automotive and manufacturing employment restructured. Automation expanded, and regional economic gravity shifted, leaving behind neighborhoods built for double the current population and housing stock that never fully disappeared alongside the jobs. And when that much physical inventory remains while demand contracts, pricing resets accordingly, not temporarily, but generationally, creating a housing market where under $100,000 properties are not anomalies, but norms. Driving through Saginaw offers a tangible illustration of that compression. Blocks of sturdy mid-century homes, brick facades, broad residential streets, and commercial strips that reflect both endurance and aging infrastructure. And this physical environment reframes affordability in a way national headlines rarely acknowledge, because at $60,000 median valuation, ownership is not theoretical here. It is mathematically accessible to households earning far less than national averages, and monthly mortgage payments often fall below typical rental costs in larger metros, even accounting for insurance and taxes. But here is where systemic critique sharpens, because median household incomes in Saginaw trail national figures, and job growth has been uneven across the past several decades, meaning that low housing prices reflect not just excess supply, but constrained wage expansion. And this interplay between affordability and economic velocity defines lived experience more than the price tag alone, shaping everything from school district funding stability to small business viability to neighborhood reinvestment cycles. There is also a psychological dimension to living in a $60,000 median housing market, because while coastal buyers debate bidding wars and escalation clauses, Saginaw residents often negotiate calmly over inspection repairs, closing timelines, and modest appraisals, and the contrast feels almost absurd when viewed side by side, as if two separate housing systems operate within the same country without ever intersecting, which in many ways they do, divided by capital flow patterns and demographic migration trends that channel investment toward high-growth metros while leaving legacy industrial cities to stabilize around local demand. The 2022 housing surge did ripple into Saginaw, but unlike in Sunbelt or Mountain West cities where values doubled rapidly, appreciation here remained modest relative to national trends, and median values stayed firmly under $100,000. Underscoring how deeply anchored this market is to long-term population patterns rather than short-term speculative waves, and that anchoring insulates residents from extreme volatility, but also limits the kind of explosive equity gains that characterize hotter markets. For residents, this creates a trade-off landscape that is pragmatic rather than aspirational, because low entry prices reduce financial strain and make ownership feasible even with moderate incomes. Yet resale liquidity depends heavily on local demand rather than national buyer inflows, meaning homeowners often view property as stability rather than leverage, and that mindset shifts the emotional relationship to housing entirely, from asset speculation to shelter continuity. Saginaw's under $100K market also reveals something broader about American regional economics. When capital concentrates intensely in select corridors, legacy industrial cities do not necessarily collapse into abandonment. They recalibrate at lower equilibrium points, maintaining functional infrastructure, community institutions, and housing access without participating in the growth velocity that dominates headlines, and that recalibration can feel both grounding and limiting at the same time, offering affordability while reflecting slower demographic expansion. The lived experience here often includes larger lot sizes, durable construction, and neighborhoods that feel physically substantial, yet accompanied by slower retail turnover and gradual reinvestment rather than rapid transformation. And that steady cadence contrasts sharply with the acceleration narrative driving many metro housing crises. If Gadsden showed regional recalibration, Anniston reflected structural stagnation, and Pine Bluff demonstrated scale without surge, Saginaw intensifies the conversation by illustrating what deep population decline does to pricing long-term, compressing values to levels that make ownership attainable but signal economic divergence from national growth centers. And as we move further up this list, the next city will push that divergence even harder, with housing medians undercutting even Saginaw's numbers and exposing just how far the affordability gap can stretch in modern America. If Saginaw felt compressed, Flint, Michigan feels exposed, because when you say Flint, most people think of headlines before they think of housing data. And that reflex alone tells you how reputation interacts with real estate value in ways spreadsheets never fully capture. Because in a city of roughly 81,000 residents, according to the 2020 census, median home values have hovered around $65,000 in recent market data. And that figure persists not because the housing stock vanished or because no one lives there, but because the long-term population decline from a 1,960 peak near 196,000 residents fundamentally reshaped supply and demand over half a century. Flint's industrial arc is well documented, anchored historically by automotive manufacturing and General Motors employment. And as those jobs contracted through the late 20th century, population followed, leaving behind neighborhoods constructed for nearly double the current resident base. And when tens of thousands of people leave but houses remain, market equilibrium adjusts downward until local income levels and buyer demand intersect, which in Flint means median prices under $100,000 remain not only possible but normal. Driving through Flint illustrates the math in concrete form. Blocks of mid-century ranch homes, brick colonials, and post-war builds standing on lots that reflect a more populous era, and while some areas show vacancy or disrepair, others remain actively owner-occupied and maintained, reinforcing the reality that low prices here are not uniform abandonment but selective demand. And this nuance matters because the median figure reflects both stable neighborhoods and distressed pockets aggregated into one number. The 2022 housing surge did impact Flint, pushing values modestly upward, but median home prices remained around the mid-$60,000 range, demonstrating how deeply rooted the market is in local wage baselines rather than speculative investor flows, and that anchoring shields residents from dramatic boom-bust volatility, but also signals limited outside capital inflow compared to high-growth metros. Median household income in Flint trails national averages significantly, and poverty rates remain elevated relative to U.S. benchmarks, and these economic realities are inseparable from housing valuation because property markets do not exist in isolation from income generation capacity, which means that while buyers can enter the market at extremely low cost relative to national norms, the surrounding economic ecosystem evolves at a slower, more constrained pace. There is a stark contrast embedded in Flint's affordability, because in cities where median homes exceed $400,000, buyers often stretch debt-to-income ratios to secure entry, while in Flint, the cost of ownership can fall below typical rental prices in major metros, fundamentally altering the risk profile of housing decisions. Yet that lower entry cost does not eliminate structural challenges, including infrastructure, maintenance burdens, uneven neighborhood reinvestment, and limited job diversification beyond healthcare, education, and regional services. The emotional experience of living in a $65,000 median housing market is complex, because on one hand, ownership becomes attainable without generational wealth, and mortgage payments may resemble car payments rather than life-altering commitments. But on the other hand, appreciation expectations temper accordingly, and resale liquidity often depends on local buyers rather than national migration inflows, creating a market that values stability over rapid growth. Flint also reveals how narrative affects valuation, because reputational damage tied to past crises lingers long after infrastructure upgrades and policy changes occur, and perception alone can suppress outside demand even when housing stock remains structurally sound, reinforcing a pricing equilibrium that reflects not only economics but psychology, and this interplay between narrative and capital flow demonstrates how markets can diverge sharply from national averages without complete collapse. Systemically, Flint underscores a broader American imbalance. While capital concentrates in technology corridors, coastal metros, and fast-growth Sunbelt cities, legacy industrial regions absorb slower reinvestment cycles, leaving behind accessible housing markets that function quietly beneath national discourse, and that divergence is not temporary. It has been decades in the making and continues to shape geographic inequality in ownership access. For residents, the consequences are tangible: lower housing costs, reduce monthly financial strain, and provide pathways to ownership that are statistically impossible in many urban cores. Yet, slower job growth limits, upward wage mobility, and municipal revenue tied to property assessments constraints large-scale infrastructure improvements, embedding affordability within a slower growth framework rather than a rapid appreciation narrative. If Saginaw demonstrated compression and Pine Bluff showed scale without surge, Flint adds reputational drag layered onto structural contraction, intensifying the conversation about how far affordability can diverge from national medians. And as we move into the top 3 entries on this list, the next city will push median values even lower, forcing an even sharper confrontation with what under-minus $100K housing truly signals in modern America. If Flint felt exposed, Johnstown, Pennsylvania feels like a time capsule that never fully rejoined the national acceleration cycle. And that distinction matters, because Johnstown is not a peripheral suburb or a fading rural outpost. It is a city of roughly 17,000 residents as of the 2020 census, with a deep industrial legacy, and yet median home values have hovered around $70,000 in recent housing data. placing it comfortably under the $100K threshold in a country where the national median approaches $390,000, and that gap is not cosmetic. It reflects decades of demographic contraction layered over economic restructuring that permanently altered demand dynamics. Johnstown's population once exceeded 60,000 inches the early 20th century, anchored by steel production and heavy manufacturing. But as those industries declined, residents relocated in search of employment elsewhere, leaving behind a housing stock built for a far denser community than the one that remains. And when supply persists while demand shrinks, pricing adjusts downward, not through a crash, but through slow recalibration, which is precisely what happened here across the latter half of the 20th century and into the present. Driving through Johnstown offers a visual narrative of that recalibration. Hillside neighborhoods filled with sturdy brick homes, older Victorian and early 20th century properties that were constructed with durability in mind, and narrow streets that suggest a once bustling population. And in this environment, a $70,000 median home price feels less like a distressed liquidation and more like a long-settled equilibrium tied directly to local income levels rather than speculative outside interest. The 2020-2022 housing surge that pushed prices upward nationwide did ripple through Johnstown modestly, but it did not break the $100K median barrier, demonstrating how deeply this market remains anchored to regional earning power, and that anchoring shields residents from the kind of volatility seen in boomtowns. Yet it also limits the pace of appreciation, reinforcing a housing culture oriented around stability rather than leverage. Median household income in Johnstown trails national averages, reflecting the city's ongoing transition from heavy industry toward healthcare, education, and regional service employment, and this economic structure directly influences housing valuation because markets price homes according to what local buyers can realistically afford, not according to aspirational narratives broadcast on national media. There is an almost surreal contrast when comparing Johnstown's $70,000 median homes to metropolitan starter homes approaching $500,000, because in Johnstown, a buyer with modest savings can realistically own without stretching debt ratios to extremes. And monthly mortgage payments often fall below what urban renters pay for studio apartments, and yet that affordability exists alongside slower job growth, limited corporate relocation, and gradual downtown revitalization efforts, rather than explosive redevelopment cycles. Systemically, Johnstown illustrates how long-term industrial contraction creates enduring housing affordability, not because the houses lack structural integrity, but because population decline reduces competitive bidding pressure. And this dynamic reveals something uncomfortable about national housing narratives. Scarcity is not universal. It is geographically concentrated, and places like Johnstown exist in parallel economic universes where ownership remains accessible precisely because external capital has not flooded in. The lived experience reflects this divergence. Neighborhoods feel quieter, commutes are short, and financial stress tied to housing costs is often significantly lower than in high-growth metros, yet municipal budgets remain constrained by lower property assessments, limiting the speed of infrastructure upgrades and commercial reinvestment, embedding affordability within a slower growth ecosystem that trades rapid equity accumulation for long-term cost control. Dark humor emerges naturally in this environment because while coastal buyers compete with cash offers and waive inspections to secure entry, Johnstown buyers often negotiate methodically, schedule inspections without panic, and close without bidding wars. As if the national housing frenzy were a distant rumor rather than a shared reality, and that divergence underscores how deeply segmented American housing markets have become. Johnstown's sub-$100K housing market is not a loophole. It is the result of generational demographic shifts and capital redistribution patterns that favored certain regions while leaving others to recalibrate downward, and that recalibration has created a pathway to ownership that remains viable for working-class households without extraordinary leverage, even if economic dynamism unfolds more gradually than in high-growth metros. If Flint highlighted reputational drag and Saginaw demonstrated compression, Johnstown intensifies the story by revealing how historic industrial centers can sustain under $100K medians long after national prices surge. And As we move toward the final two towns on this list, the next entry will push affordability even further, showing what happens when median values drop closer to $60,000 and the housing gap between regions becomes almost impossible to ignore. If Johnstown felt like a time capsule, Youngstown, Ohio feels like a structural case study, because when you look at a city that once housed well over 150,000 residents and now counts roughly 60,000 according to the 2020 census, and then you see median home values hovering around $75,000 in recent housing data, you are no longer observing a quirky outlier. You are observing the long-term economic mathematics of industrial contraction playing out in real time. And that math is not emotional, it is relentless, because when population declines for decades, while housing stock remains physically present, pricing has only one logical direction to move until supply and demand re-equilibrate. Youngstown's population peaked in the 1930s at over 170,000 residents, fueled by steel production and heavy industry that anchored the regional economy for generations. But beginning in the late 20th century, plant closures and job losses accelerated outmigration, and unlike fast-growth metros where supply lags demand, Youngstown faced the opposite condition. A durable housing inventory built for nearly triple its current population, which structurally suppressed home values even during national housing expansions. Driving through Youngstown, the scale of that imbalance becomes visible. Neighborhoods with wide streets and sturdy brick homes, blocks where vacancy intersperses with owner-occupied properties, and commercial corridors that reflect both endurance and economic thinning. And in this landscape, a median price under $100,000, often around $75,000, is not a promotional gimmick. It is the logical output of long-term demographic recalibration. The 2020-2022 housing surge did reach Youngstown, lifting values modestly as low interest rates and investor interest rippled into secondary markets. But unlike in Sunbelt cities where prices doubled rapidly, Youngstown's median remained under $100,000, underscoring how deeply its market is tethered to local earning capacity rather than national speculative enthusiasm, and that tethering insulated residents from severe boom-bust volatility while also limiting rapid appreciation. Median household income in Youngstown remains below national averages, and poverty rates exceed U.S. benchmarks, which directly influences buyer demand and mortgage qualification levels, meaning that housing prices align closely with what local households can realistically support rather than what external capital might theoretically pay. And that alignment creates a market where ownership is accessible, but economic growth unfolds incrementally rather than explosively. There is a dark irony embedded in Youngstown's housing market, because while buyers in coastal metros navigate $400,000 starter homes and escalating property tax bills, residents here can purchase entire houses for less than the annual rent of many urban apartments. Yet, that affordability exists alongside slower wage growth and limited job diversification, creating a trade-off structure that is financial relief paired with constrained upward mobility. Systemically, Youngstown demonstrates how regional economic divergence reshapes the American housing landscape, because capital has increasingly concentrated in technology corridors, financial hubs, and high-growth metropolitan areas, leaving legacy industrial cities to stabilize at lower valuation baselines, and that stabilization has preserved access to ownership while also reflecting decades of uneven national development policy and private investment flows. The lived experience in Youngstown often includes lower monthly housing costs, shorter commutes, and less financial strain tied to mortgage obligations. Yet municipal services must operate within tighter budgets due to lower property assessments, influencing infrastructure upgrades, school funding, and commercial redevelopment timelines. And this interplay between affordability and fiscal constraint defines daily life more than the median price figure alone. Psychologically, the housing environment feels detached from the frenzy dominating national real estate headlines, because transactions here rarely involve waived inspections or bidding wars. Instead, they reflect measured negotiations grounded in local comparables rather than speculative momentum, reinforcing the reality that America contains multiple housing systems operating simultaneously under different economic logics. Youngstown's under minus $100K median is not an anomaly. It is the endpoint of sustained population loss intersecting with durable housing supply, and that structural equilibrium reveals a side of the housing crisis narrative that rarely surfaces on national broadcasts, namely that affordability has not vanished everywhere. It has relocated into regions where demand has lagged for decades. And as we move to the final town on this list, we confront the most compressed housing market yet, where median values drop even lower, and the implications of regional divergence become impossible to ignore. If Youngstown illustrated long-term contraction, East St. Louis, Illinois represents the most extreme version of housing compression still functioning within a metropolitan footprint. Because this is not a remote rural town detached from economic corridors. This is a city of roughly 18,000 residents, as of the 2020 census, located directly across the Mississippi River from St. Pete, Louis, Missouri, and yet median home values have hovered around $55,000 in recent housing data, placing it dramatically below the $100,000 threshold and making it one of the lowest median-priced housing markets in the country within proximity to a major metro region. The population story explains much of that divergence, as East St. Louis peaked in the mid-20th century with a population exceeding 80,000 before experiencing sustained decline across subsequent decades due to industrial restructuring, suburbanization, and economic disinvestment. And when a city loses over half its population while retaining significant portions of its housing inventory, pricing adjusts downward persistently, not as a temporary dip, but as a generational recalibration tied directly to demand contraction. Driving through East St. Louis reveals blocks of older brick homes, vacant lots interspersed with occupied properties, and infrastructure built for a denser era. And this physical environment frames the median price in context, because at roughly $55,000, ownership here is not only attainable, it is often cheaper than annual rent in many large metros, yet that accessibility exists within an economic ecosystem marked by elevated poverty rates exceeding 30% and median household incomes well below national averages, conditions that anchor housing demand to local wage capacity rather than regional metro averages. The 2022 housing surge that elevated prices nationwide did ripple into East St. Louis modestly, but median values remained far below six figures, illustrating how deeply structural factors override short-term national enthusiasm when population trends and income baselines remain constrained. And this anchoring effect stabilizes the market against rapid speculative inflation while simultaneously signaling limited external investment compared to neighboring metropolitan areas. The systemic critique becomes sharper here, because East St. Louis exists within the economic orbit of a larger city, yet operates under vastly different valuation dynamics, highlighting how proximity alone does not guarantee capital inflow, and how decades of disinvestment can create a parallel housing market where prices reflect local economic realities rather than adjacent metropolitan averages, underscoring the uneven distribution of growth across even tightly connected regions. For residents, the consequences of this affordability are complex, because while homeownership can be achieved at a fraction of national cost, municipal revenue tied to property assessments remains constrained, affecting infrastructure investment, public services, and redevelopment initiatives, embedding low housing prices within a broader fiscal challenge that shapes everyday experience beyond mortgage payments alone. There is a stark irony in the fact that across the river, median home prices climb several times higher, while in East St. Louis, they remain near $55,000. And this geographic juxtaposition exposes how housing markets fragment along economic lines, even within a shared metropolitan area, creating radically different ownership pathways separated by mere miles, but defined by decades of divergent capital flow patterns. The lived experience reflects this fragmentation, with lower housing costs reducing monthly financial burdens for those able to secure stable employment, yet limited job diversification within the city itself, necessitating regional commuting for many residents. And this interplay between affordability and opportunity underscores the central trade-off embedded in every under minus $100K market we have covered. Reduced entry barriers paired with constrained local economic dynamism. Dark observational humor surfaces naturally when considering the national narrative of housing scarcity, because while buyers elsewhere debate how to afford $500,000 starter homes, entire neighborhoods here remain priced below $100,000 without bidding wars or waived inspections. And that disparity feels almost absurd until you trace it back to population shifts, income stratification, and investment concentration patterns that have unfolded over half a century. East St. Louis stands as the clearest example in this countdown of how affordability persists not as a loophole, but as a consequence. The consequence of sustained demographic contraction intersecting with limited capital inflow, and yet it also demonstrates that the American housing landscape is not uniformly inaccessible. It is segmented by geography, industry, and historical trajectory in ways that create vastly different ownership realities depending on where one stands. Across these 8 towns from Gadsden to Anniston, Pine Bluff to Saginaw, Flint to Johnstown, Youngstown to East St. Louis, the pattern is unmistakable. Under minus $100K housing still exists in meaningful numbers, but it is concentrated in regions shaped by industrial decline, population loss, and slower economic expansion, and that concentration reshapes who can buy, where they can buy, and what trade-offs they must accept in exchange for affordability, proving that the national housing crisis is not universal scarcity but uneven distribution, and whether that reality feels like opportunity or warning depends entirely on what kind of growth, financial, or geographic you are willing to trade.